State in collaboration with the Women Development Association Southern Africa network. The title of the book is Youth Voice and Participatory Arts in Global Development, and we are going to having the main group presenting for 30 minutes, and then thereafter we have got our discussants. It is Associate Professor Mavis Chin, based at Lancaster University, and Dr. Tendai Marova, based at the State University. Unfortunately, our discussant is not able to join us. So I hand over the floor.
All right, thanks very much, Kura. So just to go back to Alyson's comment about the little dinosaur, the middle of the QR code. So the book is open access, so everybody and anybody can access it, can scan the QR code to access the book. And I would like to start by expressing the main gratitude to SARChi-HEHD and the SSA Regional Network for organizing this launch. A special thanks to Kura for all the behind-the-scenes coordination effort. I know this included running around and asking questions, but today we're here. Thanks very much. We're also grateful to Lucretia, our very multi-talented office manager. This room the way it does because of her, and she has organized a very beautiful lunch for us after the launch. So sorry to all the people online that are unable to do the lunch that we have. And thank you to our discussants. Like Kura said, Willard is not able to join us today because he's traveling. He wasn't sure of this trip until yesterday. And thank you to Tendai and Melis, our very, very dear colleagues who are very well versed with the CTS project. They know about the CTS project in 2018. And we also want to appreciate the Youth Research Board for joining us today and for their contributions throughout the project. Thanks also extend to colleagues at the University of Leeds, as well as the NGOs and civil society organizations who partnered with and whom we learned a lot from. Thank you to colleagues at SARChi-HEHD, very dear colleagues bouncing ideas, asking questions about the book launch. Thanks, Mikateko, Fenella, Judith, Arina. Thank you, Gloria and Tolu, for being here today. Highly appreciated. And our sincere thanks, final but not least, go to Melanie Walker for her generous support of the CTS project since when it started, particularly when Tendai, Melis, and I were deeply involved. That's about 8 years ago. She has also generously sponsored this launch. Although she cannot be here in person today because she's traveling, she has sent a very thoughtful and beautiful review of the book chapters that she has read. Now to the book. The book highlights the importance of engaging young people in diverse voices, ideas, and knowledge in decisions that affect them, enabling their recognition as active citizens and supporting more inclusive societies. Drawing on youth-led participatory research from Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America, the book examines artistic approaches, including participatory filmmaking, street art, as well as photo voice, and connects this to formal and non-formal education. It introduces the concept of transracial voice to advance systemic justice and demonstrates how arts-based methods expand the understanding of young people's experiences and knowledges, contributing to ongoing debates in the epistemic space. In contributing to ongoing epistemic debates, the book attempts to respond to commonly asked questions. Who gets to be a knower? Whose knowledge counts? What makes that knowledge count over others? And what makes it legitimate? We'll see in chapters 5 and 6, where we have examples from Cambodia, Malaysia, Rwanda, and Zimbabwe on how projects informing the book attempt to address this question. These examples demonstrate what the projects that the projects were not about trying to understand the youth better as if they were objects of the study. Instead, the focus was on learning with the young people alongside community members and civil society organizations, and also learning from each other as researchers. In the process, supporting the young people to be agents in their communities based on the diverse knowledge they possess. This way, there was a recentering of knowledge creation, challenging models of knowledge production that have in the past marginalized or overlooked young people. If the project's interest had only been to understand, there would have been a risk of reinforcing a hierarchy where they are reduced to data. Therefore, shifting focus towards learning with them meant that knowledge was co-created, relational, and dynamic. There is also another methodological attempt in the book aimed at invoking discussions on the standardized and prescribed ways of writing and conducting research, specific academic settings. In writing this book, we chose to write as a collective, the May Group, and deciding on a collective name, making decisions by consensus, sharing and discussing feedback, and holding space for learning from each other was what the writing process was about. Naturally, this approach carries certain risks within academic questions. Key questions arise. Will institutions regard our work legitimate because we are used to second, first author, that kind of hierarchy? Again, how can it be sustained within systems that privilege only individual output and incentivize individualism? While these are real concerns, to ground multiple ways of knowing the system historically shaped by knowledge marginalization and separation, individualism is to venture into the unknown and to provoke critical reflection in the spaces we work in. So the book consists of 7 chapters, and the May Group members will discuss specific aspects of the book for about 5 to 6 minutes each. Speaking after me will be Alyson, Brody, who will speak to young people will speak about young people in the context of global challenges and development. And after that, we will have Harvey speaking about theorizing youth voice, the transnational. Cooke will speak about transracial art of youth development. And Katie will speak about transracial education and social change. She will also talk about moving the conversation on. Inés will provide reflections working with the Youth Research Board, and she will also introduce the Youth Research Board, who are part of the people online. Then this will move over to discussants, starting with Melis and followed by Tendai, at which point I will then hand over to Kura. Thanks, Kura, and now it's over to Alyson.
Hello, I hope you can hear me okay. So, as Faith has said, my chapter, or not my chapter, this is very much a co-produced collaborative effort. So the chapter that I contributed most to was really about context setting, sort of outlining some of the key issues for young people in really sort of looking within the context of global development challenges and looking specifically on what's changed, if anything, for young people in the past 20 years, and also trying to understand perceptions of young people's roles and values within those change processes. And I think a really sort of core question, how far have young people been able to be writers of and actors in their own story, or stories of change, which was story of, yeah, which is really the kind of framing concept for the programme that this book has come from. So the chapter focuses really on the way that young people have been positioned in development policy and other narratives as on one hand, relatively powerless patients of growing inequality and rapid socioeconomic shifts that are associated with globalization and digitization. And on the other hand, as critical agents in and of processes, an integral part of solution building for these global development problems. And it reflects particularly on reasons between what is really a gap between the intention to address all of these complex challenges while empowering young people, and then the reality of a world where young people's needs and concerns just too often remain on the sidelines of policy and practice. So the starting point for the chapter is the 2007 World Development Report, which was called Development and the Next Generation. And for those of you who aren't that familiar with World Development Reports, they're very much agenda setting. So they're led by the World Bank, and they're really kind of flagships for global development policy, and they draw on really robust data sets to make their case for spending and programming in the critical areas that they outline. And they've really played a key role in sort of alerting the development community to particular key issues. So one, for example, is the intersections between climate change and gender equality, but also gender equality as a whole, as a really kind of key lever of development. So the WDR 2007, it reflected, but it also created a springboard for the growing positive youth development movement, which really made this group that falls between childhood and adulthood more visible. So I think that there had been quite a sidelining or a kind of invisibility of that group. And it's presented data to highlight specific challenges faced by these young people across a range of issues. And what's very clear is that all of these challenges, and I'll summarize some of the evidence around some of the core issues, but a lot of the challenges that were identified nearly 20 years ago remain the same. So very little has changed, and in some cases things have got worse. So to give you an example, the first key area is education. So SDG4 really focuses on the need for quality of education. So it's not enough to be getting young people to get children into and young people into education. They need to be equipped with relevant knowledge. There needs to be an education system that's fit for purpose. And in 2007, the World Development Report reflected on the really poor quality of education globally, and just noted that even though primary school enrolment rates and secondary school enrolment rates were increasing, overall education wasn't arming students with the skills and knowledge that matched market demand. It wasn't preparing them for life or work, or both. And when we kind of fast forward to 20 years, it's very clear from the evidence that there is that these problems persist. The achievement of SDG4 is far from there. It's far from being realised, and the data in particular reflects a shortage of teachers. There's a kind of 65 million gap in the requirement for teachers across the world, particularly in the global south. Overcrowded classrooms, work overload, and too much reliance on very outdated methods, and not enough focus on building what are deemed soft skills like confidence building, problem solving, resilience, support as well. The second theme is youth unemployment. So SDG 5 focuses on the need to promote inclusive economic growth for all, but it really highlighted the global problem of chronic youth unemployment. And I think from the news in the UK, and just I'm sure you're aware also, nearly 20 years on, and the situation has really got worse. So the global average unemployment rate reported by the International Labour Organization in 2005 was 13.5%, and then 2025, it was 13.3%, and young people were 3.5 times more likely to be unemployed than people over the age of 25. So there isn't really enough robust data to explain that phenomenon, but I think it's clear that a really key contributing factor is the move to digitization, AI, automation, which really constituted the entry-level jobs that young people would often take up. So another crisis is political voice and representation. So in 2007 and before that, there was really a declining interest of young people in mainstream politics, and really moving two decades on, there's really a kind of very palpable sense of disillusionment. I don't think you can blame young people for being disillusioned with politics. And then in the 2019 UK elections, only 47% of young people aged 18 to 24 voted, and that was the lowest turnout of any group. Obviously, young people are still engaged in politics, but it's often more sort of campaigning, movement building, non-mainstream type politics. But they very much care, but they don't agree with what's happening in with what political parties are doing and what they're promising and failing to deliver. So another key area is gender-based discrimination, and the world. So you may be familiar with the World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index that tracks indicators for I think there's around 84 countries globally that participate in this. So it tracks indicators in women's economic and political participation, as well as health and education. And in 2025, it found that there are, despite progress over the last 20 years, there are still really significant gaps particularly in economic and political parity. And yeah, I think that they predicted that it would take 125 years to achieve global gender parity at the rate we're going. So it's really, really concerning. So I think so on the surface, so there's a rise of there was a reaction, and people did take into consideration and act on the recommendations of the 2007 report that really talked about the need to listen to young people and to really involve them in decisions about their lives. But I think it's and on the back of that, there were various initiatives, lots of youth involvement in various kind of contexts. For example, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs convened an annual social council youth forum since 2012 to engage young people in identifying solutions to global development challenges. But it's very clear that this apparent focus on youth really hasn't translated into change. So we need to ask why. And I'll just sort of wrap up in a minute or two. But just to note first, there's really been a tendency to instrumentalize young people. So sort of looking at them as in terms of being a dividend, a sort of global dividend. So there's a growing youth population. So the emphasis has been on looking at how that can be translated into human capital and contribute to economies, rather than really thinking about young people as individuals with rights and complex needs. Then there's kind of this sense where young people, they're sort of simultaneously co-opted into, but also kept on the margins of existing structures and processes. So they're there in person, but they don't contribute to the real decision making. They're sort of kept out of the real meat of those big decisions, and so they're not being involved in the kinds of radical systemic changes and paradigmic shifts that are needed to improve their lives and their livelihoods. And then we also need to, and this is a key theme in the book, which Faith touched on, is this need to promote epistemic justice, and we'll explain more in the other presentations. But that's moving beyond this tendency to privilege certain forms of knowledge and giving value equal space to alternative languages and forms of expression. And so just to end by saying what's needed is really to shift the conditions of youth engagement for change to happen. So we can't continue to work within these same frameworks, using the same language formats, assumptions. We need to really meet young people where they are and promote their agency, strengthen their own sense of power to make a difference, and create the space for expression of ideas and perspectives. And I think the examples that you'll hear will show how Changing the Story was really about trying to harness that and think about how that could send a message to a broader message on what it means to really include young people and make a positive change.
Thanks, Alyson. So obviously the book is called Youth Voice and Participatory Arts in Global Development. So one of the questions that we ask and try to address is, what is voice? Which is no small question. Voice, we take the position that voice isn't something that researchers or policymakers give to young people. It's something young people have. It's something everyone has. We're following Mikhail Bakhtin's idea that to be is to communicate. So another question we ask is, how can we listen to voice? And what we argue in the book is that sometimes voice and voices aren't audible unless they're speaking in words. And of course, even that's no guarantee that they'll be heard. But in the global north and the global west, sayability is really fundamental to voice and how we understand voice. By sayability, we mean what it's possible to say and what it's permissible to say. So voice communicates knowledge, which is sayable. What is sayable is what can be understood, and what can be understood is what is of concern in Western philosophy, both in terms of communication and in terms of human being. But so much of our experience is unsayable, especially for people who are marginalized in different ways, especially in post-conflict settings where people are recovering from trauma or indeed experiencing trauma at that time. But also because often our experiences of knowing and being just can't be articulated in words. So in the book, we develop a trans-rational approach to voice. And a trans-rational approach sees the mind and the body as bound up together and sees knowing and being as inseparable. So a trans-rational approach works across and through and beyond the binaries on which our global northern ideas about communication and being are based. So self-other, mind-body, rational, non-rational. A trans-rational approach enables space for all those unsayable aspects of experience, so the emotional, embodied, spiritual, sacred, discordant, collective, aesthetic ways of knowing, and acknowledges that these are entangled with the rational ways of knowing, the psychological, the cognitive, the analytical, and so on. So taking this approach has enabled us to analyse how voice operates both through and beyond language and the sayable. So we show how young people's voices not only express their ways of knowing, but are actually intricately bound up with how they do knowing and being. And we show how voice is collectively produced beyond the responsibility of the individual speaker and bound to and in young people's relationships in and with their worlds. So this isn't a project of seeking to better understand the young people that we've worked with per se, but rather it's a project of ongoing listening and learning with them and working towards epistemic justice by welcoming difference, contradiction and complexity because of their transformative potential. And in doing that, aiming to interrupt the dominant structures of knowledge creation. Thank you. Over to Paul, I think.
Brilliant stuff. Thanks very much, Lou. Thanks, Alyson, for setting this up so nicely. So really what we've had so far is sort of like the underpinning context for the book. Just before we go on, can I just say thank you to Faith as well, and to all your colleagues over there for putting this together. It's a great honour to be part of this international launch of the book. So the next chapter looked at how this context and also how this theoretical approach translates into some of the art that was produced. And I was particularly interested in this aspect of it because it's quite a weird thing that in arts-based participatory projects per se, quite often, and in fact more often than not, the art is pretty much entirely ignored. We've recently just done a literature review of some 7,000 studies of arts-based practices looking at mental health research where arts-based practices are being used. And of those 7,000 studies, only 121 of them talk about the art at all, which is quite remarkable, really. So in our project, we wanted to make sure that we really looked at what the art seemed to be communicating in the way that Lou has just described, not least because quite often it's the art that drives the participation. You know, people quite often do this stuff because they want to make a film or they want to make a piece of theatre or they want to write something. So we wanted to focus in on that and give art its due in this project. And so what I'm going to do now, in a bit of a cop-out, because it's about the art doing the talking, I'm going to let the art doing the talking up rather than me. But I want to show you a short set of clips from a project that we conducted in Colombia with the University of El Rosario. This was led by Dr. Matthew Charles. And what Matt did was he worked with a group of young people to interview former child soldiers. So these child soldiers were kind of like probably, you know, sort of 15, 16 when they were recruited or groomed, depending on the perspective, to take part in the Colombian Civil War. Okay, so hundreds of thousands of these people were recruited, and so the aim of the project was to, on the one hand, to capture the experience of these people, so that this experience was fed into the National Historical Archive of the Civil War, which was being produced at the time. Okay, so it's making sure that their perspective was captured for history. But the way Matt did this was he worked with groups of young people that are currently or were currently sort of at that age range, some of whom are here today, that are part of our youth research board. And they interviewed the former child soldiers to capture their experience. Their experiences were then turned into kind of monologues, which were then acted out or spoken out by actors in order to protect anonymity, and then they were accompanied by animations. So the young people worked with professional animators to produce some stunning animations to tell the story of the child soldiers who fought the war in Colombia, and lots of interesting material uncovered from that process. So if I could pass over to Lucretia, I think you're going to play this your end. So, or Faith, if you could play the clip, and then I'll pass on to Katie.
Thank you very much. Just to echo Paul's thanks as well. Thank you, everybody, and Faith and the team for hosting us. And apologies you can't see me. I'm having technical issues with my camera. But just to try and kind of bring together these different elements that we've been discussing. So within the context that Alyson described at the start of youth dissatisfaction with formal education, a widespread exclusion of young people from economic and political processes, and within the context of limits to what is deemed to be sayable in societies, and particularly in conflict-affected societies, but not exclusively in conflict-affected societies. So within this kind of broader context, we examine through the book how young people have expressed themselves transrationally in the way that Lou described through their engagement in participatory arts projects. We found throughout the different projects that engaging in participatory arts elicited an affective response in many of the young people who used the process of both kind of engaging with art and through arts to reflect on their own relational positionality in society, challenge restrictions on what's deemed to be sayable in society, and develop nuanced and affective understandings of the past and present, both for themselves, but also to share with wider groups within society. And I think that film that we've just seen that Paul has shared really demonstrates this importance of affect and transrational voice. So it's not just the kind of words that came through there, but also the animations, the music and the sound and the different feelings that those evoked, both in the young people who were making the films, as well as us in audiences of the films. So we found that through these processes, young people created collective spaces for voice, dialogue and action through their artwork, and that much of the artwork can be read as a call to action of sorts. And I really encourage everybody here today to have a look at the Changing the Story website, because on there's an online youth curated exhibition of some of the many different forms of artwork that were produced through the project. So we understand the participation in these processes and the creation of this artwork and how young people went on to use their art to kind of engage other members of society as political actions that young people were taking towards a more socially and epistemically just future that they themselves kind of envisioned through the projects. These actions can be spread through enabling ecologies of action. And we particularly focus on this idea of spreading in the book rather than and separate to the idea of scaling, which is often used in global development. And this idea of scaling projects often actually can result in epistemic injustice in global development programming. So we focus on this idea of how these kind of political actions that young people engage in can be spread throughout their communities and beyond. So all in all, we argue that how young people choose to express themselves and what they communicate through this expression needs to be taken seriously within global development. Youth-led processes towards change need to be embedded within and supported by governments, international organisations, civil society and community, and understanding the different ways that young people express themselves and kind of this idea of transrational voice is central to taking young people seriously. So this means that we need to do more than simply engage young people in short-term development programming. Their kind of voice and their expressions of voice need to be taken seriously. So since the project, the different academics who worked on the project, the researchers, the civil society organisations and the young people who were engaged in changing the story have taken their work from the project in many different directions. So I'm really excited to hear from some of the discussants today who are part of Changing the Story to share their reflections. We also have a video coming up from our Youth Research Board who themselves have kind of gone on to take their experience of engaging in the project in different ways. One way in which Paul and I are furthering this work now is to understand this idea through the idea of accountability. So working to understand how global development can be accountable to young people, ensuring that programming that claims to be developed for young people becomes a process of power sharing that embeds young people's voice and voice in all senses of the word that we unpack through this book at each stage of programming. So I'll stop there and hand over to Inés.
Thanks, Katie, and everybody who's spoken so far. And yeah, also just to echo, thank you, Faith, and the organisation and everybody based in Bloemfontein today for joining us and for hosting us. So I don't know, I was going to just pull up very briefly the Youth Research Board website. I don't know if Faith or Lucretia, you could get it up, or I could try from here.
Please try and put it up from that side.
Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's actually the wrong. Yeah. Okay. So my name's Inés Soria-Donlan, and I was the project manager for Changing the Story, which is the project, the kind of programme from which this book has emerged. And it's been my real pleasure as well to be part of the May Group and contribute to this publication. So one of the things that we wanted to do throughout the project, and kind of in relation to some of the stuff that everybody else has touched on, is really think about how the governance of Changing the Story, the way that we ran the project and delivered the project and kind of identified its direction, also reflected the approaches and questions and values that we were trying to explore from the research. So how as a team could we upend a little bit the kind of traditional hierarchies that might exist in research projects, particularly research projects that involve colleagues from lots of different countries, that involve young people and civil society and artists alongside academics. How could we mix up the roles a little bit and kind of think about how the different ways in which people could contribute to the direction that the project was going in? And one of those, in fact, probably the major, one of the major initiatives that we did in response to that was developing a youth research board. And this happened a couple of, I think 1 or 2 years into the project, because we wanted to first make sure that in establishing a youth research board, we could ensure there was a clear remit and a clear value and a clear kind of a governance role for the young people involved, so that this wasn't just a kind of tokenistic gesture. And so the Youth Research Board came into being. These are the 11 researchers, young researchers that joined the board, and everybody in this group had participated in previous iterations of Changing the Story funded projects in their mostly in the countries in which they were based. And the Youth Research Board were really, really instrumental to the project, really. They undertook a period of knowledge exchange and development where, and you can kind of explore this more on the website, but where they had various workshops around some of the project's approaches, but also with different artists from different settings and different people that were involved in the different projects, so that they could also build a kind of creative research toolkit that they could then decide how they wanted to apply to the work. And they were involved in some public artwork, development of public artworks in their own right as part of that project, but the main focus of their work was really to evaluate Changing the Story from their perspective and hold us to account as much as possible in terms of the direction of the project and how relevant that felt to them as young people, young change makers across the world. So they provided a really comprehensive evaluation using creative methods of the project, which is available on our website. As Katie mentioned, they also developed these digital and physical exhibitions. I don't know, Faith, if you've got one actually, but that kind of captured a lot of the work, creative outputs from all the different projects that had taken place over changing the story, as Paul said, to really make sure that we didn't discount the kind of creative value of all those things that had been created. And they also worked to develop some campaigns, which is this area here, that felt relevant to their own context, but could also apply to the more international context in which they were working as a youth research board. So the Planet of No Memory, each campaign was developed by at least, I think, 3 youth research board members from different countries. Planet of No Memory talks about that issue of kind of memory and conflict, and how do younger generations kind of retain that context whilst also be able to look forward. There was a really brilliant campaign about youth employment, and also about, relating to Alyson's point, how do we ensure the education systems people are within are equipping young people for their future. And it was really, really our kind of pleasure, and I think everybody in the May group will attest to this. We also learned so much from the Youth Research Board, and continue to learn a lot in terms of what we need to do going forward. So some of you will be aware that we held a book launch in September as well. And it was really, really brilliant to have members of the Youth Research Board be part of that. And we spent a long time in the run-up kind of reflecting on the book together, and heard from the Youth Research Board about their responses to the book, where they felt we needed to go further, what we felt we needed to do next. Stop sharing for a moment. And so I'm going to show you now a little excerpt of that feedback from the Youth Research Board. Unfortunately, we don't have time to feature all of it, but just a couple of things before we play that video, which will kind of tell you a little bit more about their experiences of being part of changing the story, and how that's impacted on them beyond the project. A couple of other questions we asked them were, what do you think about the book? And do you have any reflections on its main argument or ideas? And just to summarise briefly some of those points, everybody really resonated with that idea of transrational voice that Lou has brilliantly kind of given us an introduction to earlier, and particularly in terms of their practice as artists, found that was really, really useful to see a kind of the theory that lay behind some of the work that they were doing quite instinctively. They also mentioned that it was interesting, 5 years on, looking at their work now and how they would have done that kind of differently, and that it would be nice to see reflections as well of how young people reflect on work that's happened, given that young people are not a static entity, like all of us, they're constantly changing. And that was also something that they wanted to make sure we held on to as people that work with youth, that we recognise that they are not a homogenous group, and it's not a static group. They're constantly changing, and we need to adapt programmes to see them through different stages of their life cycles as well. They also really found the book useful in kind of providing some tools to support people, to support others to make change. So could see how the book could provide some useful information in terms of them offering kind of peer support to other young people as youth leaders. There were some questions around, it's brilliant to have youth involvement in projects, but actually, how do we ensure that the young people that we involve in these projects are also representative of the communities we're trying to reach, and that it's not just young people with the most privilege that are kind of the easiest to get access to, if you like, and that come involved? How do projects ensure we go further to make sure, there's wider representation? Also felt that the book was really good in kind of highlighting, beyond just reports and data, how important the reflection of lived experiences was in shaping development agendas. And then we also asked them a question about kind of, where do we need to go next? What do we need to go further? Jesus, who's from Venezuela, gave some really, really interesting reflections about you know, the next question is perhaps, do young people need more voice? As Lou's saying, we already have voice, it's about who listens to them. Or is it more about kind of stripping back, being able to dismantle some of those systems of injustice and inclusivity? And whilst really echoing the value that the kind of arts-based approaches have provided, in terms of next steps, thinking about how we ensure spaces for youth voice are built, not just through art, but within institutions, education and politics. So now, you know, if the art-based approaches can provide a foundation to illustrate that, how do we then integrate that into the systems that can really deal, you know, with epistemic injustice at a broader scale? And Tahira, who's from South Africa, also told us, reminded us, you know, that we must not forget to care, and that real change begins with care at the most human level. And for those of us working with young people, this means ensuring that youth voice are not only included during a project, but also have the power to shape what happens after the project ends. And that was something we really spent a long time as a team thinking about. How do you end these sorts of projects well and kind of allow support young people also to sustain the connections they've built beyond the lifespan of kind of individual initiatives. So there were some of the reflections, but I'm now going to pass a kind of summary, but I'm going to now play a little excerpt from the September launch where members of the Youth Research Board are talking about their experiences of changing the story and the impact that's had, so you can get a little bit of a sense of the kind of reality of some of the work we were doing. So if you can play the video from, I think 5 minutes 20 should be the right place. Just until the next, yeah.
With 5 minutes, that's right?
5 minutes, 20 seconds, yeah. I think, yeah, that's it.
I'm sorry, I have to pause to just double check with people online. I can see that Tendai cannot hear. Is there anyone else who cannot hear? The sound doesn't have sound.
I can hear it fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe Tendai, it might be your network. Could you please just double check? Thank you. Thank you, Inés. I think we'll stop there for the sake of time. Thank you very much to the MAGE team. I think now we move over to our discussants. We have 10 minutes each to reflect on. We'll start with Melis and then move over to Tendai. That will leave us with 10 minutes for reflections from the audience. Thank you. Over to you, Melis.
Thank you, Faith. Well, thank you all for the opportunity to reflect this impressive piece of work, actually, and which builds on almost a 7 or 6 year long project. And the Participatory Arts and Global Development Scholarship that Inés and Paul set out in their 2019 book. So it's an ongoing conversation. Having read the previous books as well, I can see that there's a lot in terms of continuation, but there's also a lot of a change in the way that how the thinking has changed around the youth, arts and development. So what stands out immediately, I think in this book for me, is that it's not simply a book about young people or participatory arts. It's about rethinking knowledge, rethinking power, and most importantly, rethinking how we listen to young people. The book's key argument is that young people occupy a paradoxical position in global development because they're often framed as vulnerable, marginalized, or living through multiple crises, but at the same time, they are also positioned as society's greatest assets for futures. So this paradox, as the book shows, is not merely a rhetorical one. It shapes how youth are included, consulted, instrumentalized, or silenced within policy and practice. So I think the first strength of the book is its analysis of this contradiction. And as the book analyzes this contradiction, I want to draw out 4 concepts that it kind of approaches quite uniquely in their analysis, which helps them to think more broadly in relation to this paradoxical puzzle. I think the first concept I'm going to be talking about is the voice. I mean, across the chapters, the authors take a concept that is often used very casually, youth voice, right? But what we see is that the authors have worked through this concept to really deepen it, and voice in the book come as an epistemic practice, a way of producing knowledge, meaning and critique. And I think this is where the book makes a major intervention, because it moves beyond rational verbal expressions of voice and introduces the idea of transrational, which is presented as a way of understanding voice as embodied, effective, spiritual and aesthetic, and even more than human. So it challenges this decades of policy frameworks that see voice with speech and agency, with verbal articulation. So I think one of the most powerful ideas in the book is in relation to, again, voice is disability, and that what young people can express is shaped by what is socially, politically and emotionally permissible. And here, what I see is that the authors is giving a lot of the authors placing the arts-based method centrally, and it becomes crucial because they let young people express what is otherwise unsayable. So the art speaks when the words cannot. So that takes me to the second concept that I want to highlight in the book, and that's the participatory arts. And I think another major contribution is the insistence that the artistic outputs themselves are also the knowledge itself. So too often when we look into the global development literature, what we see is that the practitioners use art to get young people talking, or sometimes an icebreaker activity. It's a method, and at its best, sometimes a methodology. And the book challenges this. It argues that the artwork, whatever form it is, like a film, dance, and a poem, is not supplemental. It carries the emotional weight, historical memory, cultural meaning, critique, and hope in the ways that cannot be captured by transcripts or interviews. So here the art does not simply illustrate youth voice. Actually, it is the voice itself. And beyond the question of voice, it is also the epistemology through which art is created, interpreted, that shapes experiences, that shapes how young people's experiences are understood and valued and made visible. And moving forward, not quite a concept, but I would say, but the third actually aspect of the book that I want to take up is the youth research boards. The youth research board described in this book was another strength that I find really particularly engaging, and as we've seen in the videos as well. It modeled meaningful participation. So young people led workshops throughout the project, evaluated work projects. They produced international campaigns. I think what was most impressive was their silent workshop, where they insisted that academics talk too much. And I just reminded myself as I was, coming up with this reflection as well, that I shouldn't talk too much. But it's kind of, this their silent workshop actually beautifully embodies the book's argument. It's forced adults into discomfort, into non-understanding, into listening differently. So that moment alone actually captures the transformative potential of that translational approach that's been mentioned in the book. And the last kind of the concept I want to talk about is the ecologies of change. So the book explicitly criticizes scaling up, which is so common in development studies. And what it argues instead is the pockets of actions. And pockets of actions are small, relational, effective spaces where epistemic justice emerges. And I think this is a compelling and ethical stance. It avoids extraction, it avoids oversimplification, and it highlights the importance of local histories and contexts. But also the book doesn't romanticize these pockets, and that's also something really important to note. Authors are very aware of this problem of romanticizing, and they speak about the structural constraints like short project cycles, weak institutional support, educational systems that silence youth, and policy frameworks that kind of instrumentalizes them. So these four concepts, I would say, were just like sitting at the center of the books, and to really give the argument around what youth voice is, what art is, and how we should listen to. And now I want to just kind of draw out a few critical questions that the book kind of invited us to think about. You may not have answers for that, I don't know either, but I think it's kind of good to think about them to keep the conversation going on. So the first is can the translational travel into policy spaces that remain deeply rationalist? Because when we look into development institutions, and they are often built on indicators, outcomes, tangible changes. So they're not designed to accommodate this nonlinear, effective, embodied knowledge. So the question becomes, what would a policy framework look like that genuinely centered translational voice? Or more critically, what would have to change in our institutions for this to be possible? I mean, this is a challenge not only for policymakers, it's a challenge for all of us in academia, in the higher education, and for all of us working with young people. My second question is, actually, this was something I also raised in another HDSA event like a couple of weeks ago, when I was again reflecting and giving a critique on Stephen's book on political education. Because art, so how do we avoid, and the question that I raised there and here that I feel like it's important to raise is that how do we avoid aestheticizing young people's suffering? Because arts-based development always risks turning into something palatable, like a story, a performance, a product. And the book is deeply aware of that risk, but the field more broadly is not, I'm afraid. So I leave an open and provocative question here about how can we protect youth-created art from becoming a consumable object in donor-driven ecosystems? And the third question is, what about the long term? I mean, the authors rightly acknowledge in the book that the lack of longitudinal evidence. Young people often express hope, agency, and desire for change at the end of a project. But what happens 1 year later or 5 years later? So how can we build research relationships that endure beyond the funding cycles? I mean, this is a question that we've been always talking about, but I think it's important to raise it again and again, just to remind us, like, how do we keep those relationships going on? And the last question is that, how do we engage with the political risks? I mean, art can be politically dangerous, and we have seen this in the past. And in this project, I see that in Kosovo, Zimbabwe, Colombia, Cambodia, young people were working with the histories of conflict, surveillance, and trauma. So this raises an ethical question. How do we support youth expression when the act of expressing itself can be risky? So we must think carefully about safeguarding, anonymity, and collective protection. But how do we do this? How do we walk the talk? So I know that I've spoken a lot. I just want to kind of wrap it up. And I want to finish by saying that what this book achieves is that it refuses easy answers. And it refuses the neatness of that policy language. It refuses simplifications of youth empowerment narratives. And it asks us to rethink the foundations of how we understand knowledge, participation, creativity, and justice. It insists that youth voice is not a resource to be extracted, but a relationship that we should nurture. It shows that arts-based practices does not merely help young people tell stories, but lets them inhabit stories, challenge silences, build solidarities, and imagine futures. And perhaps most importantly, it invites all of us as practitioners, educators, researchers, and policymakers to listen differently, to act differently, to create conditions in which transracial voice can flourish. So I believe that this book opens a conversation that we must now continue. And the challenge that it leaves us is that it's not enough to recognize the youth voice, but to transform the systems that make it so difficult to hear. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Melis, for that. Yes. I think we'll move over to Tendai for now, and then we will respond to all the questions after Tendai has said something. Over to you, Tendai.
Thank you very much, Faith. Let me try to put the camera on. I just hope and pray that it's going to be very effective and very efficient. Melis, thank you for laying the groundwork and laying a very firm foundation for the discussion after the presenters and the reflections on the book. I find the book very, very interesting in so many ways. And I think it's quite enriching for academics, though it may leave some gaps for those who are interested in more practical work, that is work that informs the practice within the various contexts in which the young people will be operating in. So let me start by, I'm going to use a different approach from the approach which has been used by Melis. I will start off by looking at what fascinated me most, perhaps chapter by chapter, instead of taking a holistic approach. The first chapter to me was quite informing and very promising indeed, because it clearly outlined the intersection of youth voice, epistemic justice, and arts-based development as very important for creating inclusive as well as equitable societies. Yeah, I also took note of the fact that the chapter also recognizes and amplifies the voice of young people, advocates for that, young people through arts. And it actually says that by so doing, foster an environment where the young people can actively participate in shaping their future, as well as addressing the challenges that they face in their everyday lives. I was also fascinated by the way the chapter tried to, tease out various concepts which we're going to meet throughout the book, which to me opened space for me to really understand how these concepts and ideas are operationalized within the book itself. I was also fascinated by the idea that it also touched a little bit on issues to do with the decolonization, which I think is also very important and very critical, especially in this era that we are living in, when decolonial scholarship is gaining much ground. I know that that is contested space, but the fact that the chapter tries to engage with that particular concept was also very interesting to me. I also like the idea that it teased out various ideas around the theories, frameworks, which are usually used by many scholars when they you look at positive youth development. And the concept of positive youth development itself, to me, is also a concept that is very important, because development is not always as we anticipate it to be in the positive sense. Now, the rest of the book expands on what has been introduced in the very first chapter, and yes, chapter 2 did a nice job of trying to tease out, issues to do with young people in the context of global challenges and development policy. And the major takeaways in the chapter for me tries to underscore the idea that while youth are frequently highlighted in many development discourses, in many development scholarship, they still remain, on the periphery in terms of how they are included in practice in framing those particular policies. And therefore, it's not surprising to me that it therefore calls for a transformative approach to policing and move beyond just rhetoric in terms of including young people within the context of policy making, as well as the context of making them become active agents, empowered agents within the society that they live in. I also like the idea that the book tries to theorize, youth voice, and brings out very complex issues surrounding that, because it actually acknowledges that it is not an easy process, which I think it is not as well. But the fact that it has made effort, it's providing ground on which we could build on from. And from my reading of the chapter, I want to think that the chapter tries its best to do what it can, given the limited space of that small book. The chapter insisted then that the voice of the young people should not be confined to, some rationalists or colonial definitions of speech, which speaks to ideas around decoloniality, but also emphasize that it should embrace a trans-rational perspective, which can be recognized in diverse forms of expression, artistic, emotional, embodied, as legitimate. Thereby, this then leads to an expansion of the possibilities for young people to participate in solidarity, as well as to move towards a more just agenda. I also realized that chapter 4 expands on the idea of transrational art of youth development, and does it so well, as the chapter insists that the young people through art should not be at the periphery, but should be provided with a very rich, a foundation through which they could be empowered in order for them to become key players in the affairs that affected them in their everyday lives. I also looked at chapter 5. Chapter 5 to me was very, because it's a mind of always working. I mean, looking at where we say the reason why most of our projects become very weak is because they are framed within, the economic framings, and it tries to demonstrate that participatory, youth-driven, and arts-based approaches are vital pathways to achieving a more robust and a more inclusive justice system, instead of just focusing on the economic affairs of the young people. I therefore want to, after having done this, I therefore want to look at what I think could have been a bit more, nuanced in terms of articulation within the whole book. I don't know which chapter could have handled that, but number one, I want to think that, yes, arts are very important, and participatory arts especially, for young people to express themselves. But like has been said by Melis, there's always the bigger, context in which they operate, which is so limiting. And many times scholars don't offer solutions on how the young people should navigate those particular contexts. In as much as arts can be used in saying out what is not easily sayable, but again, trying to do so at times comes at a cost in different contexts, particularly in contexts where there's restricted democratic space. Being artistic itself becomes a very risky business. And how do young people then navigate that particular terrain? As a result, I would want to think that perhaps we can do better if we also look at the other side of us. Yes, there's the stronger side. There's also the weaker side. Instead of just romanticizing us as the thing, as the panacea to all the problems that we may have, in order for us to empower the young people and to enable them to do what they value to do or to be. I think we should also look at what is it that what limitations are there of using these arts-based, methods in trying to do this particular thing. And lastly, I also have a feeling and an understanding that at times some of the methods that we advocate for appeal to just the elites and appeal less to those who would have targeted to, actually engage. For example, we'll be talking about marginalized young people, but how many of these marginalized young people are so open to, arts-based methods like the ones that we will be talking about in this particular book? I foresee the danger that we tend then to speak to an audience that is already in the arts field, rather than also speak to a wider audience, especially those who would not have been exposed to that. Having said that, I would want to give thanks to the May Group. I don't know why they call themselves the May Group, but all the same, it's the May Group as they call themselves. A very big round of applause for coming up with such a well-packaged book, for trying to cover that much within the little given space that they had. With this, I conclude my response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tendai. We have 10 minutes left, and it would be good for the May Group to respond to some of the questions, not all the ones that we want to respond to. I'm not sure if after that we'll have time for questions, whether online or in the room. But if anyone has questions that might not be responded to, please send an email, and then engagement can continue. You can send an email to anyone who puts their email address. Yes, Inés, you've got something to say, please go ahead.
Just very quickly, Leonard from the research board was here, but I think his connection must have dropped out. But if anyone has any specific questions for the youth research board, I'm happy to forward those on and I can get back to you as well from their perspective.
Great. Do you mind adding your email address to the chat, please? Yes. Okay. Does any member of the May group want to respond to Melis's or Tendai's reflections? Lou, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you both, Melis and Tendai. It was really, really fascinating to hear your reflections there. Really lovely. And just thank you for your really deep engagement. I just wanted to, well, actually, what made me think of saying this was Melis's question about how does the transnational travel into policy spaces? How do we keep these research relationships going? And then also Tendai's point about why we're called the May Group. And we're called the May Group partly because we were working together, we were meeting together in Leeds in May, and we thought the idea of thinking about the time and how the time connects to different seasons across the global north and the global south. It seems spring and autumn, these seasons of kind of change, seemed very appropriate to what we were doing, but also the sort of the modality of May, that we're not talking about fixed knowledge and what will happen or what we have done, but what might happen, a kind of open, desired future as a result. So that idea of the May Group really speaks to something collective. And I really want to reiterate the idea of sort of collectivity, because all this thing that we've done and these things that we're doing, we're really politically committed to this idea of the collective and the idea that we want to resist the individualization of knowledge, the individualization of agency and responsibility that our universities are increasingly pushing us towards. Well, that our universities have been for a long time, but this kind of competitive, individualistic kind of drive in universities is something that we're really trying to resist. And so in partial answer to the questions about how do we keep this going, how do we speak to policy, this is very much a collective responsibility. And I don't just mean us collectively as the May Group, but collectively as academics, but collectively as universities. This is something that we need to push in our universities, put pressure on our kind of university leaders to be thinking, yeah, how can they support us as academics, as researchers to do this? How can we keep these ethical, responsible research relationships going and try to maintain that responsibility when we've only got a day and a half of research and we've got to do all these competitive things to keep our universities kind of funded and in the rankings. I think this needs to be a collective endeavour that we need to create collective pressure to address. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Anyone else from the May Group who wants to say something? Inés, there's +1. I can't see the other person.
It's me, Faith, Katie.
You go first, Katie.
That's okay. Well, so I was going to follow on from the policy comment as well. I think it was a really important, and thank you again. I've said thank you in the chat, but thank you very much, Melis and Tendai. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts, and thank you so much for engaging with the book in such depth. I think the policy question is really important in terms of how can the transnational travel into policy space, and I think as Lou's kind of very kind of well put there, it's a very kind of political process that needs continuing work. I just wanted to share an example from the project that Paul and I are currently working on to show that it can sometimes happen to a degree. I'm not saying that it was the be all and end all, but we ran a workshop in Rwanda with an organisation called Hope and Homes for Children in July, and as part of that workshop a group of young people created animations. Paul did a kind of stop film animation with them around what the future would look like for them. This project's working with a group of young people from care, and so it's particularly around the deinstitutionalisation of childcare. And the young people took the films to the High Commissioner in Rwanda, the British High Commissioner in Rwanda, and showed the films there. And I think both that process was really powerful in terms of that kind of visual representation of how young people see their lives and experiences. So I think that kind of showed that there is space for participatory arts and transrational voice within that space. Having said that, there was also a lot of kind of talk and conversation as well, so the kind of more rational side of things. But that has kind of led on to some, it's not policy change yet, but lots of policy engagement. So I think that there can be spaces for this, but that also at the moment it's really dependent on kind of having somebody in a position of power who's willing to listen to these different kind of conceptualizations of voice and take that on board. So I think so that's kind of an example of ongoing work, but I think it also comes back to the final point you made, Melis, around the need to engage in wider social structures. And I think that that's something that's really missing in global development programming. And I think, Lou, you've explained really well there how it's also kind of missing in some of the work that we do or are able to do and have space to do as academics. So I think, you know, this question of engaging in wider political structures is a really crucial one. But Paul, I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about the project, because you've been making more films with young people.
No, nothing to add to that. And we're aware that we haven't got much time. So Inés, if you want to go, but just to echo that it is really difficult to do this. The young people can't do this on their own. They need to have the support of the institutions that they're working with. There needs to be proper scaffolding. But the key thing is that you know, young people need to be in the room.
Thank you, Paul. I see it's 2 minutes to go, and I know that we have to end at 18:30 because some people are traveling. I'll have to hand over to Kura for something burning. I must say, just to Melis and Tendai, that some of your questions, I think as the May group, will have to write a blog post just to respond to some of the questions that you have raised. So you have given us ideas to continue working as the May group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faith, and the presenters and our discussants. I think due to time constraints, I will have to request those online got questions. If you have questions, you may raise your hand before we move on to those in the room. Anyone online who has a question can raise or a comment can raise for her. Or you can use chat box. Okay, if there are no questions online, you can have one or two. Those in the room. Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much to everybody, to the maker, to the discussants. Very interesting presentation and a very nice book. I'm going to ask the question that popped into my mind, which was a practical one. In the interest of time, don't really want an answer now, but just throw it out there. And it was really to you, Paul. I think it was a comment you raised the question. It's a very complex project you did with the country. Yes. Paul, you made a comment about the need to look at what the art communicates rather than just that there's art. And I wondered about how you actually think about with different forms of art, how you actually interpret or analyze the art.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Okay, no one, that's fine. Okay, thank you. I think we are just on time. This is one. Thank you so much to Faith.
Hello, respond? No. People want to respond?
All right, so thank you so much, Faith, and to our presenters. Really appreciate it, and to our discussant as well, that is named Entai, and to those who are in the room joining us. This marks the end of our book launch. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, guys. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Bye.